Good morning, everyone, and welcome to Webinar Wednesday. My name is Lisa Lowe, and I'll be moderating today's session. Our Project Line Solutions Senior Solutions Advisor, Jerwin Begonia, is going to go through the top 3 things to know about dropshipping. You can type your questions into the questions panel on the right side of your screen at any point throughout the session, and we'll leave some time at the end for Jerwin to answer those. Jerwin, I'll pass it over to you.
Thank you very much, Lisa, and welcome everybody. So as Lisa mentioned, we're going to be talking about drop shipping. There's a lot of buzz about drop shipping, depending on what type of business you're in. A lot of businesses have been asking about how to deploy drop shipping within their company. But before we get into that, let's talk about the agenda very quickly. So we'll define what drop shipping is. We'll talk about different use case scenarios within different types of businesses. And then we'll go into the prerequisites. How do we set up drop shipping within SAP Business One? And then we'll go through a couple of use case demo scenarios. And then we'll follow it up with some tips and tricks that you can use to extend the functionality of drop shipping within SAP Business One. And then we'll finish things off with some very quick analytics, dashboards, KPIs, some reporting, and then we'll wrap things up with a quick summary. So what exactly is drop shipping? It's really just an order fulfillment strategy where products don't need to be inventoried within your warehouse. So instead, when an item is sold, it is purchased and shipped directly from the vendor or manufacturer to the end customer. So what are some examples? Why would a business use it? For example, a business might purely be an e-commerce storefront. They're really just an online retailer. They never carry any stock. An e-commerce order comes into the system and a PO goes out to the vendor and gets drop shipped directly to the end customer. A common scenario is a business is physically out of stock or they're low on stock, and to save time, instead of bringing the items in from the vendor to your warehouse and then shipping it to the customer, they just get it shipped directly from the vendor to the customer to save time. The business might sell a rare item. This could be a seasonal item, a one-off item, maybe it's a promotional item or a gift, something that they just don't really carry in stock. So it makes sense to, have it drop shipped directly from the vendor to the customer. The item is too big for inventory. So for example, in the steel industry, with large steel products, it makes more sense to ship it directly from the steel manufacturer to the end customer. Think of a construction site. And lastly, a common scenario would be geography. A vendor's proximity could be closer to the end customer, which means faster and cheaper shipping costs. For example, my physical company and warehouse might be in Toronto, but both the end customer and the vendor are in Vancouver. So it makes sense to drop ship directly from the manufacturer or vendor from Vancouver to the end customer. Okay. So let's go into the dropship demo right now. I'm going to flip over to SAP Business One. Okay. So there's some preliminary setup that needs to be done. It's very simple and it's very quick to do. The first thing we're going to do is define our dropship warehouses. So we're going to go into administration, and then we're going to go into inventory, and then we're going to go into warehouses. I've actually already got a dropship warehouse set up, so I'm going to show it. I'm going to scroll to a dropship warehouse. So you can see I've given it a very unique code called DS for dropship, my warehouse name. You can define the relevant tax code associated with it, the location, but there's really no address, right? It's a virtual warehouse. What's important to note are these checkboxes on the top right here. We need to check the box that says dropship. Once you check this box, you'll see an additional box called Manage Serial Numbers and Batches. This is important and it only appears once you click this box. This allows you to track serial and batch numbers that are shipped from the vendor to the end customer. So for example, when a vendor or a vendor goods receipt PO or AP invoice is created, it's going to prompt you to record the serial or batch numbers. On the AR side, when you create a delivery or an AR invoice to the end customer, it will also prompt you to record the serial or batch numbers that were sent to the end customer. So this is important if you, for example, service serialized items. You want to keep track of these batch numbers. The next thing you want to make sure you do is uncheck the box that says nettable. By default, nettable is checked. So basically, what this means is item quantities will not be calculated for this warehouse. So for example, when you go into the item master data under the inventory tab, you see the in-stock quantities, the committed, the on order, and available. Those will never be calculated because you're not actually bringing any stock into your warehouse. Sorry, somebody keeps muting me. So therefore, deselecting this box means no stock quantity calculations will be performed against this warehouse. Okay. What's also very important to know, I just want to make sure that everybody is aware of this. SAP Business One does not record any inventory postings when you use a dropship warehouse. Therefore, there's no journal entry related to the inventory. There's no inventory accounting transactions that are posted. Only the AR and AP and P&L accounts, such as the revenue taxes, are affected. Okay, so when you create an AR invoice or an AP invoice where a dropship warehouse is used, you'll never see an inventory transaction. Your GL accounts, your inventory GL accounts will never be affected. Why? Because there's no actual inventory moving in and out of a warehouse. So it's never going to affect your valuation for, let's say, for example, moving average or FIFO, et cetera, et cetera. Okay. So once we set up our dropship warehouse, we want to make sure that we also set up the customer's ship to addresses as well within the BP master data. And within the actual item master data, we might also want to set up a default warehouse for certain items. So for example, I'm going to pick an item here. I'm going to pick an item that's very big. This is a big printer. It's used in big agencies, marketing agencies, or print agencies. It's massive. It's like 20 feet long. So it makes sense to drop ship this to the end customer. We never want to bring it into our warehouse and then send it to the customer. So under the inventory data tab, I can highlight this warehouse code and I can set it as the default warehouse. So what's going to happen now is every time this item appears on a document, this warehouse code is going to come up as a default warehouse on the row. Okay. Again, if I drill into this dropship warehouse, you can see it's a dropship warehouse that we just set. Another thing you can do is under item properties is you can also define a property called dropship only item. And this is really for reporting purposes, really. So whenever you want to run a sales analysis report for all your items, for your only dropship items, you can select this property within your reports and it'll filter just these dropship items in your sales or purchasing analysis reports. One thing to also note about reports is that you will never see a dropship warehouse as a selection criteria within any inventory reports, right? So for example, if I were to pull up an inventory audit report because it's a dropship warehouse and it's not nettable, you'll never see it here in any of these inventory related reports, whether it's an inventory audit report or an inventory posting report. And again, that's because no inventory physically flows in and out of a dropship warehouse. Okay, on the customer side, if we pick a customer, let's say, for example, Ryerson University, there's a few things we can do here. So for example, under properties, you might want to define a property called dropship only customer. Again, this will be useful in your sales or sales reporting, I should say, for the customers. So if you do a sales analysis and you want to filter by dropship only customers, it'll filter those customers based on this selection criteria. So just to understand that visually, if I open up the sales analysis report and I do it based on customer property here, where I select dropship only customers as a property selection criteria, and then I run my report, it's just going to filter my report based on this particular customer for Ryerson, right? Okay, so the other thing we want to do is make sure that we have, relevant dropship addresses defined for our customer. So let's go back to actually our Ryerson customer here. So Ryerson, under the address tab, they might have several ship to addresses defined. In my demo scenario, there's only one dropship, or there's only one ship to address, but theoretically they could have several ship to addresses defined. What you can do is actually make one of these addresses default to the ship to warehouse. If I scroll down, you'll see I've actually set up a field here called default warehouse. So whenever this ship to address is selected on a sales order or on any sales document, it will default to a dropship warehouse based on this setting here. So for example, let's look at a sales order and let's select our customer Ryerson. So if I select this ship to address, for example, the system will automatically allocate the dropship warehouse on the row. So for example, if I pick any item, you can see on the warehouse column, it's automatically going to select the dropship warehouse. So remember, this was an item where we did not set the default warehouse to be dropship. We actually set it to be London, but because of that setting, it's actually overriding that and it's selecting the dropship warehouse on the row. Now, remember that other item that we set up, that large printer? It was under here. So I believe it was this item here. You can see, because we set the default warehouse for this item to be dropship, it's automatically selecting this warehouse, and that's gonna happen for any customer that we choose, right? So if I created another sales order for a different customer, let's say DWH Inc., and I select the same item, oh, in this case, it didn't work. I don't think there was a default warehouse for that. I'll have to take a look at that, but it's supposed to automatically put the default warehouse of DS in that row. I'll take a look at that in a bit. Okay. So now that we've set up some preliminary stuff, we want to see the dropship functionality in action. So a use case scenario might be that we need to drop ship an item to a customer because the item is too big to inventory, so it goes directly from vendor to the end customer. So typically we're going to start off with a sales order, right? In this case, we'll select Ryerson again. Okay, we'll put in our delivery date. We'll select our couple of big items here, or this one big item here. And let's say we want to purchase a quantity of 5 of these. Okay, so we have a drop ship warehouse defined here. The important thing here is to go under the logistics tab, and you'll see a couple of checkboxes here. The one that we need to check is this one here, where it says procurement document for drop ship warehouse lines. So let's take it back a bit. The scenario is we want to drop ship this big printer directly from the vendor to the customer, but we also want the vendor PO to be automatically generated from the customer sales order. So by checking this box here, it's going to automatically generate a PO to the vendor. So once I click on add, it invokes the procurement confirmation wizard. Some of you may have seen this before, but basically what it does, it's a little step-by-step wizard that allows you to create a purchase order directly to the vendor. So what we're doing here is we're just going to verify some of the information. I'm just going to expand my column width a bit here. So you can see the quantity is 5. The dropship warehouse is defined here, but also note that the ship to address is the same ship to address that's defined on the sales order. This is the end customer ship to address, right? It's not our warehouse address, it's the end customer ship to address. So that automatically gets populated there. So the next step is basically we want to create the purchase order. So when we click on next, you'll see there's a golden arrow here that says procurement document number 161 is being created for vendor V0001, right? So if I drill into that, you'll see that a PO to this particular vendor has already been created automatically. You can even see in the remarks the base document. It's based on sales order 215. You can also see the base document on the row level as well. By default, these fields aren't shown, these columns aren't shown, but if you want to show these columns, just simply go to form settings and make sure that the base type and base ref checkboxes are checked in order to show these fields on the row. Okay. Let's put in our vendor reference number. So let's say, for example, the vendor has received our purchase order. They've given back a vendor reference number, which is their order number. And they've also provided us with an invoice, and they've also provided us with a tracking number, right? So what we want to do is we want to copy the PO to an AP invoice, right? But remember, the vendor has also given us a tracking number, right? So we can record the tracking number as well. One second here. I noticed that the tracking number field isn't showing. That's okay. Okay, here it is, the tracking number. So what we're going to do is pull up that make-believe invoice from our vendor. So let's say, for example, here's the invoice from our vendor, and here's the tracking number, right? I'm just going to manually copy and paste this into SAP. Copy that, and I'll paste that here. So I've got a relevant tracking number. Now, if I want to, I can get a little bit fancy, and I can have SAP automatically populate this tracking number against the original sales order, right? And then from there, we can automatically copy that customer sales order to an AR invoice. So the way I've done this automation is I've used something called BWinUp. A lot of customers out there are familiar with BWinUp. It's an add-on from Boyum that allows you to extend the functionality of SAP Business One. So for example, I've put in a macro, which is just a set of instructions that says, if I double click on this field, I want it to automatically transfer this shipping or tracking number back to the original sales order, right? So if I click on this base document here, let's pull up the original sales order. You can see there's no tracking number here, right? So by double clicking on here, it's going to call up the original sales order, right? And if you look at the logistics tab, it's going to automatically populate the tracking number. Now that I have this tracking number, I can also click on copy to an AP invoice because we know it's been shipped directly from the vendor to the customer. So now we can invoice the customer because we have confirmation of delivery from the vendor. What I've also done was I've created a button up here called USPS Tracking. So I can click on this button, and what it's going to do, it's going to look up the tracking information related to United States Postal Services for this particular tracking number, and you can see a label is created, not yet in the system, but it'll give you the relevant status of this particular shipment. Okay. So, why is that important? It just makes things easier to find in the system. So if a customer calls you and they say, what is the status of my drop shipped order? You can basically bring that information up in seconds and have a satisfied customer because you were able to resolve their inquiry within seconds. So the final step here really is to copy the sales order to an invoice. Now, some customers will actually do a delivery. Even though it's a drop ship item, they'll create a delivery note just to send to the customer that, hey, this has been delivered. This is proof of delivery. It's not necessary because remember, there is no inventory transaction taking place. Inventory is not being decremented. The quantities are not being decremented from inventory, and your inventory valuation, your dollars, are not being affected at all, right? But if you want to see it in action, I can simply copy this to a delivery. I can add it, right? And normally a delivery under the accounting tab will have a golden arrow behind beside the journal remark, but remember, there's no journal remark for a drop shipped item because it never passes through the inventory. If I copy the delivery to an AR invoice, there will be an accounting transaction, but it's really just your P&L accounts that are being affected. In other words, your revenue and the customer's AR account is going to be affected as well, I should say. So if we add this, and we drill into the journal remark of the AR invoice, you'll see, the control account for Ryerson has been debited, the relevant tax and sales revenue accounts have been credited as well. right? And let's take a look actually at the AP side of things as well. So if we go back to our original purchase order, and we copy this to an AP invoice. And we look at the journal remark, you'll see the relevant journal remarks, the vendor control accounts being credited and the tax is being affected, etc., right? But no inventory transaction. Now, if we do a right click and we go to relationship map, we can see our whole dropship process, right? Started off with a sales order and went to a purchase order to our vendor. We got an invoice from our vendor. And then we got a confirmation from our vendor with a tracking number that it's been shipped. We updated our sales order with that tracking number. We created a delivery just for basically proof of delivery documentation, and subsequently finished with an AR invoice, right? We sent a customer an invoice for billing. So that's the full cycle of a dropship scenario. One thing we can also do is create some queries as well. Actually, before we do that, I want to show you a formatted search that I did on the sales order. So if I bring up the original sales order, or I create a new sales order, for example, for Ryerson, and I pick an item, under the warehouse field, you'll see that I've actually got a formatted search. The reason why I know there's a formatted search is because there's a magnifying glass on here, right? So if I do Alt Shift F2, I can bring up the formatted search. And what it's doing is it's setting the default warehouse based on the customer ship to address. So I've created a formatted search, which is basically an instruction that says, hey, SAP, I want you to grab the respective default warehouse based on this customer's ship to address, right? So again, if you look under logistics, if you look at this field here, the ship to address, within this ship to address, right, there is a relevant field called default warehouse code. So whenever I select a specific ship to address, it's going to put in the respective default warehouse code on the row. And I use that with a basic formatted search. Okay. And if you need help setting that up, just simply give your consultant a shout, or myself a shout, and we'll be happy to assist you with that. Okay. So let's also take a look at some of the analytics. One thing you might notice on my dashboard here is that on the right side, I've got two KPIs. I've got one called year-to-date dropship sales amount. And if I hover my mouse over that, you can see we've sold 1.63 million. You can see just below that, my 2019 dropship sales target was 1.5. So I'm above that. And because I'm above that, you can see that this arrow is pointing up and the color is blue. You can see here, I have another KPI called year-to-date dropship sales quantity. So these are the number of units that I've actually sold and dropshipped to customers. 562 units, but you can see the font is red, the arrow is pointing down because I'm below my 2019 target, and my target is about 1,000 dropship units for 2019. So when I hit 1,000 and above, you'll see that this color scheme will change to blue and the arrow will be pointing up. Other reporting that I've done as well is I've created some very simple queries. If I go into my query manager and under sales, I have something called dropship warehouse sales orders, right? And I can double click that. It's going to bring up the query and it shows me all of my dropship sales orders, and I can see the document status. So this is important because if I have, I can see a lot of these are closed, but some of these are open, right? And I can actually filter by the open ones. So so this is important because if I have some open ones, it might mean that I haven't actually billed my customer, or I haven't received payment from my customer for these dropship items as well. You can also see if there's tracking numbers associated with these dropship orders. If there's no tracking number, then that's a sign that your vendor hasn't physically shipped out the goods yet. So you might want to contact your vendor and ask them what the delay is for these dropship items. Another one is the total dropship sales. So again, this is how I built my KPI up here. I wrote a very simple query that shows my total dropship sales. And I used this query to build my KPI here. And I used the same query to build my dropship sales by quantity query. Another thing to note is that you can actually create alerts as well. So what I've done is under administration, approve alerts management. If I scroll to the last one here, you'll see that I have an alert called open dropship sales orders. And these relevant people within my company will be alerted with an email or with an internal email within SAP or an external email within Outlook. And it happens every day at 8 a.m. So basically, this is a proactive report that tells my employees about what dropship orders are still open. So to see that, let's just take a look here. I'll go to my message alerts overview window here, and here it is. So you can see here, I've got a couple of sales orders here that are still open. I can drill into the sales order and see that these have yet to be invoiced yet, right? They've yet to be copied to an air invoice. It could be for various reasons. Maybe we haven't received the tracking number yet. Items haven't been shipped from our vendor yet, whatnot. But it's a nice proactive report to stay on top of all your open dropship orders. And that's just another way of the system working for you. Okay. Some of the other, like I said, there's some purchasing analysis reports that you can do as well. We ran through some of the sales analysis reports. I'll show you another scenario here. So for sales analysis, if I run it by items, right, I can run it for items with the property set to dropship only items. And I can also set a customer property where I want to look at only dropship only customers. And if I run that report, right, it's going to filter just these invoices, for example, based on that selection criteria. So it's a nice way to filter down and look at your dropship analytics. That's about it for today's dropship demo. I'd like to kind of recap some of the things we looked at. So I'm just going to bring up my PowerPoint here. So key points to take home. Dropship is fully supported in SAP Business One. I just showed you some of the best practices there. Very simple setup, minimal setup to get started. It's a very easy workflow, especially with the procurement document generation wizard. And then you have some extensible functionality. So the extensible functionality is everything from the formatted searches that I showed you, some of the B1 up logic that we can use to extend the functionality. For example, making a tracking number, pulling up the tracking information to the US, to the courier's website, tracking website, as well as being able to copy tracking numbers from the purchase order directly to the sales order, and some quick analytics as well, like how to create these queries and make them into proactive alerts, as well as easy to understand KPIs on your dashboard. So with that being said, I'd like to, thank everybody for joining today's webinar, and maybe ask Lisa to open up the floor and take any questions.
Thanks, Jerwin. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Perfect. Thanks for a great presentation. I don't see any questions at this point, so I'd like to thank everyone for attending today. You'll receive a follow-up email tomorrow with a link to the recording on our website, so feel free to share with anyone on your team that you think might benefit. When the session ends, you'll see a short survey display in your browser window. If you would take a minute to fill that in and let us know how we did and what you would like to see in future webinars, we really appreciate the feedback. Thanks again for attending, and we hope to see you at the next month's webinar.